So here's what the Liberals are actually saying about the carbon tax. Now, folks, I watched the entire Liberal leadership debate, so you don't have to. I saw what they said on the carbon tax. So here's what I want to do. I'm just going to play some clips from you of what the main Liberal leadership candidates said about the carbon tax. We're going to listen together, and then I'm just going to go on a little rant. All right, sound good? Okay, let's start with Mark Carney. Here's what Carney said about carbon taxes. Give it a listen.
Yes, I support ending the consumer carbon tax, and to be absolutely clear, that's on consumers, it'd be on small businesses, it'd be on farms as well. The reason I do is twofold. One, politics is about people, and this has become too divisive for Canadians. Okay. Secondly, the contribution of the consumer carbon tax is a little less than 10% of our emissions reductions. And I've spent a substantial portion of my career working on these issues. And there are better ways to accomplish those emissions reductions, particularly on my proposal, is that big polluters will pay Canadians, not taxpayers, big polluters will pay Canadians for their emission reductions and will improve the options for and the ability of those companies, who are some of our most important companies, to get their own emissions down.
Okay, so Carney doesn't want to end carbon taxes, right? He just doesn't want you to know or see or feel that you're paying the carbon tax. Now, Carney is talking about ending the consumer carbon tax, right? That's the carbon tax that you pay directly on your home heating bill or that you pay directly at the gas station. But Carney wants to keep Trudeau's hidden carbon tax on businesses. And given what he said publicly, yes, he's been very vague, but if you read between the lines, Carney wants to keep increasing Trudeau's hidden carbon tax on business. Now, look, Carney wants you to think that, only the large corporations are going to be paying his hidden carbon tax. But come on, nobody believes it because it's not true, right? A carbon tax is a carbon tax is a carbon tax that makes your life more expensive. And a carbon tax on business is a carbon tax on Canadian consumers and Canadian workers, right? Look, if you carbon tax refineries, you make gasoline more expensive. If you carbon tax utilities, you make home heating more expensive. If you carbon tax fertilizer plants, well, that drives up the cost for farmers and that makes food more expensive. Okay, so there is some good news here. Pretty much nobody buys what Carney is trying to sell. So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we just released Leger poll, and that poll showed that just 12% of Canadians believe Carney that his industrial carbon tax will mostly be paid by businesses. Just 12%, pretty much nobody believing what Carney is trying to sell. Meanwhile, 70% of Canadians understand that an industrial carbon tax on business, those costs will either mostly or somewhat be passed on to consumers through higher prices. Now, here's what I don't think Carney understands. Canadians don't want the carbon tax kind of gone. We don't want it relabeled. We want the carbon tax scrapped, period. Now, it's obvious that Carney's carbon tax will make life more expensive, but, it's also economically damaging, right? Especially given the international context, especially given what's going on in the United States, right? I mean, look, President Trump has made no bones about it. He wants to encourage businesses to set up shop in the United States. Well, the U.S. doesn't have a national carbon tax, right? There is no carbon tax from Washington. So Carney's carbon tax will push Canadian businesses to either cut production here in Canada and increase in the US, or just to set up shop in the United States, right? So Carney's carbon tax is really the worst of all worlds. It means higher prices, less production in Canada, fewer jobs for Canadians, and a weaker Canadian economy. So that's bad news, obviously. Now, there's just one more thing that I want to pick up on during Carney's talks about the carbon tax. Now, Carney doesn't see the carbon tax itself as the problem, right? Carney doesn't see the problem being that the carbon tax makes life more expensive and it doesn't work. For Carney, the problem with the carbon tax is that it's become too divisive, right? Carney sees the problem with the carbon tax as being a political problem or a perception problem. You Canadians just don't understand how good the carbon tax is for you. You Canadians just don't understand how good you've got it. Yeah, right. I think Canadians understand just fine. Thank you very much that the carbon tax is a scam. All right. Enough with what Carney said on the carbon tax. Let's turn to what Chrystia Freeland said. Here's what she said. Give it a listen. Give it a watch.
Well, since we're talking about climate action, I do want to start by recognizing the role that I think history is going to judge very positively that Prime Minister Trudeau has played on climate action. He is the first Canadian Prime Minister to really move the dial. And under his leadership, we have become a country where the economy is growing while emissions are going down. That is a huge accomplishment for our children and grandchildren. On the consumer price on pollution, I was the first candidate to come out and say I would lift that. And the reason is really simple. Democracy is about listening to people. And Canadians were very clear with us in conversations with me that they didn't think that policy worked for them. What we need is carrots. We need incentives to double down on the incentives I put in place, the Canada Growth Fund, the investment tax credits, to create a green transition that delivers jobs and growth for the Canadian economy.
Well, that was a word salad. I don't know how else to put it, right? Now, look, okay, Freeland is essentially sticking up for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's record. Look, Trudeau, with his tax hikes, with his inflationary deficits, I mean, he helped to push inflation to a 40-year high, right? The Trudeau government's policies essentially helped make gasoline, home heating, groceries unaffordable for so many Canadians, along with every other aspect of life. And I mean, Freeland was the finance minister for Trudeau as the government hiked the carbon tax every single year, making your life more expensive. So we all know that. But you know what I get a kick out of? Here's what I truly get a kick out of, that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation supporters, you, the listener and watcher, and so many other Canadians made the carbon tax so toxic that even Trudeau's former finance minister has to back away from it. Now, with Carney, similar to Carney, Freeland isn't getting rid of all the carbon taxes. I mean, she made it pretty clear that she just wants to get rid of the consumer carbon tax. Now, presumably, she's going to keep with Trudeau's hidden carbon tax on business. And as we just talked about, well, a carbon tax is a carbon tax is a carbon tax, and that carbon tax will make your life more expensive as well. Okay, so Freeland, like Carney, just wants to get rid of a carbon tax, not scrap all carbon taxes, and all carbon taxes are an expensive waste of money. Now, I do want to get into that last little segment of Freeland's comments. Freeland just talks about, more green slush funds, more wasteful spending, more taking of taxpayers' money to fund more corporate welfare under the guise of green. So watch out for that, folks. All right, enough with Freeland. Let's move on to the other Liberal leadership frontrunner, Karina Gould. Here's what she had to say about carbon taxes.
But I hear Canadians when they say that this policy is something that is challenging for them. And you know what? We didn't do a good job of talking about it. And when they are talking about the carbon tax, what are they talking about? They're talking about affordability. That's why we need a real affordability plan. It's not that they're against fighting climate change or they're against protecting the environment, but that also means that if you don't have the price on pollution, you don't have the rebate checks that millions of Canadians depend on every single.
Where do we start? Okay. Well, first, Karina Gould isn't even getting rid of the consumer carbon tax, right? She just doesn't want to increase it again on April 1, presumably just before the next federal election. I guess Gould doesn't think it would be so good to hike the carbon tax and then immediately start knocking on doors, singing for supper, trying to get your vote. Now, here's the thing. Like, Gould seems to think that you can afford the current carbon tax just fine. Gould also doesn't think that the carbon tax is the true problem. She just thinks that the government has a communications problem, right? Heard that before so many times from Trudeau, his ministers, and his Liberal MPs. Well, newsflash for Gould. The real problem isn't a communications problem, okay? Here's the real problem. The government has a carbon tax is making everyone's life more expensive problem. That's the problem. The problem is the carbon tax and all carbon taxes itself. That's the true problem. Now, Gould also repeats the Trudeau government's tired talking points about how the rebates somehow make magically everyone better off. But here's the thing. Nobody believes the government. Nobody believes Gould because it's not true, right? I mean, folks, like the parliamentary budget officer, the government's own nonpartisan, independent budget watchdog, has now produced 3 separate reports proving that the carbon tax is costing average families hundreds of dollars more every year than what they get back in rebates. Okay? We know this. We know the carbon tax costs Canadians a lot more money than they're getting back in rebates. But like, just think of the logic of what Gould and the Trudeau government has been trying to sell you for years, okay? Like, if you think that the government is going to take $20 from you and then give you $50 in return, then I've got some Ocean View property in Calgary to sell you, right? I mean, let's just think of all the different things going on here, right? So for starters, not only does the government carbon tax your fuel, the government taxes those taxes. The federal government charges its sales tax on top of the carbon tax. This carbon tax on tax alone is costing Canadians about $500 million this year. And the government doesn't even pretend to rebate that money back to you. Then on top of that, the carbon tax is also costing Canadian taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, so the government can hire a bunch of carbon tax bureaucrats to carbon tax you and your neighbors. Okay, hundreds of millions of dollars is the hit to taxpayers. So think about this, right? It's impossible for the government to hammer you with a carbon tax, then charge its sales tax on top of the carbon tax, then spend hundreds of millions of tax dollars hiring more carbon tax bureaucrats and somehow make everyone better off. That's impossible. Okay. It's not believable because it's not true. It's impossible. All right, folks. So with that, here are my main takeaways from the Liberal leadership debate focusing on the carbon tax. So number one, none of the Liberal leadership frontrunners are scrapping all carbon taxes, right? I mean, Gould, she's not even going to get rid of the consumer tax. She just wants to not hike it right before the election. It seems pretty clear to me that both Freeland and Carney, their problem isn't with the carbon tax itself, but just with the fact that you can actually see and feel the pain of the consumer carbon tax. It seems like they both, I haven't heard otherwise. It seems like they both want to keep the hidden carbon tax on business that will make your life more expensive, reduce the number of Canadian jobs, and hurt Canada's economy. Carney himself has specifically, in what he has said and wrote on his campaign website, it looks like he even wants to increase Trudeau's hidden carbon tax on business. So look, a carbon tax is a carbon tax is a carbon tax. They all make your life more expensive. Canadians don't want these politicians to get rid of a part of the carbon tax. Canadians don't want the carbon tax relabeled. Canadians want the carbon tax scrapped. And if you're ready to keep fighting with us here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation against all of these carbon taxers, well then head over to taxpayer.com, sign the petition, scrap the carbon tax.